We're on!
Can we get started on this thing, or what's the...
Oh, so this is... All right, so welcome to Our Mind on Music. We're doing cool jazz. Maybe wrapping up the bebop a little bit.
Yeah.
And then doing some cool jazz.
Yeah, so we did our Chinese New Year's episode, which hopefully you've watched and or listened to. This is episode 16.
Mm-hmm. We were discussing last time about, you know, how bebop was notey. Very notey. Do you know what I mean by notey?
Right.
Which is like lots of notes.
So a lot of people consider that to be hot jazz.
Right.
Right? Because it was very energetic, lots of notes, you know. Those runs sometimes were... And people were listening for the virtuosity of these players.
Yeah.
One of the ways that you can impress people with how virtuosic you are is to play really fast, you know?
Well, I've been revisiting the Hanon studies, as I think I told you. And, you know, when you play 16th notes at 108, which is the recommend, like when they recommend like between 60 beats per minute and 108 is sort of the top.
Okay.
Which would, if you're doing, you know, like those, that's speedy. You know, like it's
108 itself is not necessarily speedy, but 16th
notes
at 108.
At 108
so
are
108 fast. Beats per minute is what we're talking about here.
And so when you play those, and I'm just talking about the first one, which is da 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 da. That's the easiest one, right? And to do it in every key at 108 is my goal.
That's awesome.
Which I haven't got there.
Yeah.
But you know, I want to have the flexibility of being able to do that. I'm not going to play that fast all the time, but I just want to have the flexibility to be able to think like these guys did in any key at any moment because they had already gone through all of those exercises.
As you're talking about this, I'm thinking four different things. One of them is for a lot of people who haven't heard you play live, they might be thinking, well, that's a neat goal for you, Leon. Good for you, young man. And I'm thinking, this guy like flies up and down a keyboard like without thinking about it.
But in keys that I'm familiar in.
That's what I'm thinking.
Right.
That's the level of detail that a lot of people wouldn't catch, is that you can do that, but knowing that that's a key you're really comfortable in.
So C, D, E, F, G, A, B.
Right.
Right.
And already B is 5 sharps. So,
yeah, but B is okay.
Yeah.
But when you start soloing, like we play this song. It's a remake of Elton John's Sacrifice.
Okay.
Right. It's Cold Cold Heart, they call it. It's with I think it's with Dua Lipa. And it is C sharp, so it's B flat minor. Right. And as you're soloing through that, as I'm soloing through that, I'm really having to think. You know, and that's why I decided to get back to the Hanon studies, because I don't want to think. I just want to fly over the keys.
Fly. So that was one of the things I was thinking. Another thing I was thinking was that I read a couple of interviews or quotes with, especially Dizzy Gillespie. It seems like he was really good at having those like sort of one-liner type of nuggets of wisdom, you know?
Musical wisdom, yeah.
Yeah, like I don't mean that in like a sense like I'm playing down what he's saying. I really mean like he was very concise.
I know exactly what you mean. It's just like, that just bam, encapsulates it.
And that was basically, I can't remember the wording, but basically what he said is what you want is to have that sound up here be translated into your instrument. You know, it's the ability to translate that idea.
Right, and if your fingers, if your skill is limited, then what you're hearing is limited. And conversely, if your skill is really high, then the things that you can create and hear become more interesting, hopefully, right?
Yeah.
More complex, or more, you've got more to work with. You go, maybe if I could do that, right?
Yes.
Whereas if your skills are somewhat limited,
you're not gonna think like
you won't
that.
think in those terms.
So Eddie Van Halen was asked when he was doing the interview at the Smithsonian Institute, you know, basically like, how do you do this? Where do these songs come from? And he said, I don't know. Some people might be thinking he's being humble or he's being facetious or whatever.
I think he genuinely does not know.
Yeah, you've written songs, I've written songs, and I don't know where they come from.
Yeah.
I know that when they come to me, I feel really lucky if it sounds good. And I've worked really hard my whole life to be able to take that idea and turn it into something.
That's the key. And that's why I was saying, like, if you have a skill, and you can pull from it, and then you don't have to think, well, what do I want to do next?
Yeah.
Something just jumps out at you and you do it.
Right.
Right.
Well,
without knowing where
he-
it's coming from.
So Eddie Van Halen, he said he got the idea, not, and he clarifies. He said, "I never said I made up hammer-ons on the guitar, but I know when I thought of it." And it was when he went to a Zeppelin concert, and he saw Jimmy Page was playing with
one hand, or
with one hand,
yeah,
and he was like going like this, and,
right,
you know, playing the crowd, and he said he thought, well, wait a minute,
why not add another finger?
yeah, like what if I just tapped? He's just playing by tapping. He's not picking anymore. What if I tapped the other side? And then I could use this finger as the nut. I could like move up the whole thing so that the end of my guitar moves up. And so he's explaining this, which is really cool. And I love the idea that Jimmy Page brought that idea into his head.
Yeah.
But again, it comes down to he was able to translate that idea into something.
Right. Yeah, so there we're talking about a new technique or a new tool, right?
Yeah, I
and
mean,
a new way of doing things. I'm talking more about, like, he still had to get the skill.
Oh yeah, he
to
still
be
had
able
to
to-
sit down and practice it, but he already had to be at a skill level where that would even seem like a possibility.
Right.
He didn't have the internet at that point, right? So now you can go to the internet and you can find some guy in like 1930 something doing basically hammer-ons, right?
Yeah.
And it's really cool, but he didn't have that access. He didn't know that at the
No.
time, right?
No,
so
so
he had
where did
to-
that come from?
He had
Yeah,
to
it's
just think
it's
of it and then be able to put in the time to figure out how to do it.
Okay, that's 3. You said 4.
Ron Carter, I saw. It's all up here.
you accountable.
Compartmentalized that I'm doing the Vogue. Why am I doing that? Madonna's playing Toronto this summer.
Oh, wow.
Ellie hasn't been to
You
it.
going to go there?
Well, Ellie and Lucas haven't been to a concert, and they're a couple. So Ed Sheeran is playing, Madonna's playing, a couple other people, and it's like, what do you want your first concert to be?
Wow.
What was your first concert?
My very first concert? Oh, it was Barbara Mandrell and Merle Haggard.
Not the Mandrell sisters.
No,
That's way back in the day. Then
she was freaking amazing. I mean, Merle Haggard, I love.
he was looking tired, but he wasn't looking haggard.
And
That's
Well,
that's a
tried.
Dixie. That's a Dixie Chicks line.
yeah, is that from one of their songs?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. No, he was great, but Merle it's more of an icon type of thing, where she played everything. She sang amazing. I mean, she's just a force of nature.
I'll come back to Ron Carter. I haven't forgotten, but I will say she's one of those musicians. Like when we talked about the Chinese musicians, we talked about what is it, Wang Lihong?
Wang Lihong, yeah.
Wang Lihong. I mentioned in that episode that he's one of those guys that he's actually. I don't even think it's in the episode. I think it's one of our outtakes.
Maybe.
So consider this a sneak peek.
You always get the inside info from Mr.
A
Jeremy.
very handsome guy.
Yeah.
So a lot of people think that's why he's famous.
Right.
But actually, he's really talented.
Yeah.
You know, it's we mentioned Rick Springfield.
More than just a pretty face.
More than just a pretty face, I think.
Yeah.
You know, if you ask me, just my humble opinion.
Oh, pretty boy thinks he can play a guitar.
Did you just call him a git?
A guitar.
Oh, a guitar.
I don't know if that's the way they say it in Britain or not.
I don't know.
Guitar.
Barbara Mandrell is one of those people who she was really pretty and
Yeah.
she had the '80s feathered hair and the
Yeah.
whole thing.
Yeah.
You know, at the time.
Yeah. She was ahead of her time there. She was in the 70s.
All right, she was like a Farrah Fawcett on the guitar.
Exactly.
But she was a beautiful lady, but that's not why she was famous. I mean, it
Kind of like
doesn't-
Dolly,
doesn't
right?
hurt.
Dolly was, I mean,
Dolly Parton. I
Yeah.
mean, yes.
okay, so.
Ron Carter.
Ron
I gotta-
Carter.
So I watched this great interview with Ron Carter. Ron Carter's got his bass in his hand, and he's doing the interview holding the bass. And he says something to the guy, like, you know, sometimes you just got to try things out, and don't try it at home. Try it on the bandstand in front of an audience.
Wow, then, yeah.
That's when you'll know if it works or not. Dave Grohl talks about that as well.
Yeah.
A lot of their songs, they wouldn't record them until they had tried them in front of an audience.
Right.
And as he's saying this, not even thinking about it, he just goes, you know, you should try something out. And he was talking about playing, I think he played a major scale up and down. And then just without thinking, he threw in this like double stop, amazing thing, 2 notes. And he just like does this super cool thing that I'm sure it's been sampled 1,000 times now. And it was just him just chatting.
Free flowing. It's interesting that you should say that. The other day when I was doing those Hannons, I was fooling around with the shuffle.
Okay.
So instead of just doing it straight 16th notes, I was doing shuffles. And some things came out of that creatively that was just like, oh, I could use that. But I was trying to focus because I'm so
Yes.
squirrely.
I do that all the time. I'm like, okay, I'm going to go through my arpeggios all the way up the neck or all the way up the keyboard or whatever, whichever instrument I'm playing, right? I'm going to go through my and then I'm like, oh, but that sounds like Yngwie Malmsteen. I'm just going to go, can I go into that scale? And I'm like, okay, I'm on the 3rd fret.
Yo, focus. Needs more focus. Have you seen that movie?
Oh,
It's Jackie Chan, but I can't remember the name of the movie. He says, yo, focus needs more focus. I think it's the one that starts out with him in the... It's real life, and then it goes into a cartoon.
Oh, wasn't
You know the
that
one?
just his show? Like he had a cartoon show or has a cartoon show.
I don't know. Oh, no, it's a Lego, I think.
Oh,
It's a
okay.
Lego movie.
Okay.
Anyway.
Right.
Holy smokes.
Wow.
Okay. Okay, so Bebop.
Are we there yet?
We were going to talk about, you said here, we talked about,
We talked about how swing music was sort of the antecedent, the predecessor to bebop.
you got a story about Charlie Parker.
I do. So part
Do tell.
Do tell. So what I've discovered in my
Extensive research.
myriad research moments, what I found out was that it's a bit of a misnomer. What's the word I'm looking for? Misnomer.
A bit of a mistake.
Yeah, it's a mistake to think that it was like swing happened and then the next day.
There's no hard moment
Right.
where one stops and the other begins.
Right. There are websites out there that'll tell you.
And I think that'll apply to what we were talking about in other episodes where we're talking about from Baroque to classical to romanticism.
Right. And even modern day music, which I love the idea that you suggested one time about us doing that question of, is modern day music actually worse than older music?
Right.
You know, because a lot of people say music today, just like my mom said in the 80s and just like her mom said in the 50s,
Yeah. Although I saw a Ed Sheeran thing where he says, tell me any song from now,
Right.
and I'll play it on these 4 chords.
Right. But that's also true of, I mean, a lot of jazz. I don't want to say all of it, but a
A lot of
jazz.
classical as well.
Right.
You hear very similar motifs, very similar key changes, chord changes.
I talked to my kids about the 1-4-5 change, right?
Yeah.
And I'm like, this isn't just rock and roll, because I always use that as like sort of the catch your example, I
Right.
play some rock and roll. But then I go, how about this? And I play some Beethoven.
Yeah.
I'm like, if he was to sue everybody who used a 1-4-5 chord change,
He'd be a rich man
he'd
today.
be
Wait a minute.
he couldn't, because he's
Couldn't.
it's
It's too soon.
too soon.
Okay. Charlie,
Actually, there's a
I'm really sorry. I just
this is a little bit squirrel.
so
Squirrel.
sorry.
I found a great timeline that is probably showing as I say this right now. It's going to fade in nicely and then be
There
there.
it goes.
The timeline shows how actually it's probably more accurate to say that there's a lot of overlap in timing.
Yeah.
So Charlie Parker, when he was a young guy, he's from Kansas City, Kansas. And when he was growing
And I
up,
think Miles was there as well. I don't know if he's from Kansas City, but I think he was there as well. Miles Davis.
I'll tell you why I think that probably happened. When he was growing up, he's a teenager, he used to go see the Count Basie band,
Yeah.
right? Which became, in the late 30s, I think it was like 37 or something, they really hit sort of the big time. They hit their stride.
Yeah.
And everybody was sort of looking at them. Like all those guys who a few years later...
But they were swing, right?
They were swing.
Yeah.
But what I'm saying is swing was the big thing. It was the pop music of the day.
Don't mean a thing if it ain't got that swing.
Do-up, 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 do-up.
Down.
I taught them to my choir class.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So what I'm saying is, I think Charlie, Dizzy, Miles were all in that Kansas City scene, and
Yes.
then they moved it to New York.
Yes. So that's what I was going to say. All those guys who were in Minton's Playhouse a few years later, like, 41 or something like that, they would have been looking at these guys as a great example of what they could do, and then oh, wait a minute, but then we could also do this.
Who was the sax player?
Lester Young.
Lester Young.
Lester Young was the sax player at that point, around 1937.
Big influence on Charlie.
Yeah, so Charlie Parker would go to see the Count Basie band, and he would be like, it's like when I go see a band and I see the guitar player is amazing, and I spend the whole time looking at his left hand on the fretboard.
Yeah,
assuming he's a right-handed player. He would be watching Lester Young, and Lester Young had a style that I would suggest was already starting to suggest where bebop was going to, where jazz was going to go.
Was Lester Young in the Count Basie?
Yeah,
okay.
He was in the Count Basie band, and it said here Charlie Parker was influenced by Young.
This is coming straight from the tablets, by the way. Go ahead.
From the tablets?
Yeah, from the mountaintop.
Yes, yeah. There were 15 at first, but the one in the middle, I dropped it by mistake, so there are only 10 commandments. I bring you the 15, the 10 commandments.
The Lord Jehovah has given unto you these 15. 10 commandments for all to obey.
That is classic.
Our focus needs focus.
I know.
Lester Young's playing, but although he was playing in a swing band, he was doing these melodic lines that, if you think of music as sort of a fabric of all those musicians' notes fitting together and making a full picture, right? Mm-hmm. He was like weaving through them. So he was like kind of doing his own solo melody lines, I want to say, while it was happening, Instead of sort of they stop and they go into a section where it's the solo section, like bebop did.
Yeah. This is where I wish I knew more, because did he break off later on his and sort of go into the bebop?
That's a really good question. That's something we'll have to explore. Educate us.
The Bebop Boogie.
Some people think that, there's earlier stuff and wow, he was really great. No. He was always great. But his later stuff, to me, it was so soulful.
Lester Young was a huge influence on Charlie Parker, who started thinking, wait, what if the rest of the band sat back a little bit, right? And of course, we've talked about this, but give
them some room.
Yeah, give them some room. But then World War II happened, and it was not intentional that they had small bands. It was just a lot of the band was off fighting.
I don't know if we mentioned this in the other thing. I think we did. It was also that the places where these huge big band, people would go to see them and dance and whatnot.
Yeah,
that they shut some of these places down.
There was some of that. That was a lot of why Minton's Playhouse became so popular, because there was something where they weren't allowed to play for money on certain nights or something like that. So Minton's would just give them a meal instead. So they would all hang out, have their meal, play, and listen to these.
Yeah, but they would just do under the table stuff anyways. I would think.
I imagine, but if you got your player's card revoked, then you couldn't play at all.
Right.
So you had to be really careful with that stuff.
Billie Holiday
versus the United States.
Yeah, and also who was the other one you said the last time?
Thelonious Monk. He
Thelonious
couldn't play for years. He played, but he couldn't play in those venues.
That's very interesting, and I think the Kansas City scene could in theory be thought of as the birthplace of bebop.
Yeah, and you can go onto the internet and you'll find websites that say
interwebs,
and it says bebop was born on January 6th, 1941 or something, because some reporting. But it's not that clear, and the same is true when we go into Cool later.
Well, actually, when Cool Jazz started out, there was already forms of hard bop. coming through as well.
Exactly. It's just, that stuff doesn't just suddenly happen. It's like when you see an overnight star. It's an overnight star that took 20 years to get there.
Yeah. Well, and all of the training and everything that he went through.
I do want to say Charlie Christian, who we mentioned in the last episode as well. He's another one of these. The song that I mentioned and that we actually play in episode 15 is called Swing to Bop. It's a song called Swing to Bop, and it's calling out that this is a change that's happening now. And, of course, we in this one we'll be talking about the birth of the cool. So these players, they could see it happening. They knew it was happening before the rest of the world knew. That's why I say it didn't happen from one day to the next day.
And I think Miles was on a mission.
Just keep going.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like he while he was in these other groups, he was already formulating the cool jazz that he sort of was envisioning.
And as soon as he was in Cool, he was done with it.
Yeah.
He
was out of it while everybody was catching up.
Right. So by 1959,
59 was kind of blue.
Right. So
57, I think we said, was Birth of the Cool came out, and that was kind of like, Birth of the Cool,
it
right?
was, yeah.
And then 59 was kind of blue, and then he went on to Sketches of Spain. He had a couple more albums. We were talking about the piano playing on Kind of Blue for So What. It was,
But yeah, totally agree.
but I was going to say, like later, more stuff that was sort of in the cool jazz thing was Herbie Hancock, and even Watermelon Man. I mean, that's pretty cool jazz, and that's late.
So Cantaloupe Island, Cantaloupe Island. Sorry, is it Cantaloupe or Cantaloupe? Because it looks to me like it's Cantaloupe Island because it's the fruit, right? I think I mentioned in our last episode that there was like this new jack sound, which a lot of people call the acid jazz sound.
Yes.
So in the 80s, I guess, maybe it started earlier. Again, it was overlapping.
Yeah.
But I couldn't remember the name of the group that had this really clear connection between jazz. It was jazz, but they mixed it heavily with hip hop. I mentioned...
Well, Herbie does that as well.
Yes, totally, yeah. So there were some people doing that. A Tribe Called Quest put out an album where they invited Ron Carter to play on the album, which he does a lot of interviews about that as well, where he talks about how he thought that was really good because they weren't just sample. First of all, he was very apprehensive to work with a rap or hip-hop band or an MC or whatever, because he was worried about the language and the messages that they would be conveying, did it match with what he did? And he thought it was really cool that they weren't sampling older jazz recordings. They were inviting this person in to bring in what he brings to the table,
Yeah.
The way Ron Carter talks about his career is fascinating to me because he's walked the talk the whole time.
Yeah.
Since, I guess, 1960, and he's made almost 3,000 of them now,
Yeah.
Us Three was the band that I was trying to think of when I talked about the new jack sound or the acid jazz sound. Us Three had a song that they called Cantaloupe, L-O-O-P, Cantaloupe.
Oh, okay.
As in a loop is a loop is a loop is a loop is a loop. And that song uses a bunch of samples of other songs, but then they also have like sort of a rap. It's a very hip-hop feeling song with basically jazz samples interdispersed. So I'll play a sample of that just so people know what I'm talking about, but this is not bebop or cool. This is just where it went afterwards.
Groovy, jazzy, funky, bounce, bounce. dance as we dip in the melodic sea. Rhythm keeps flowing and drips to MC. Sweet sugar pop, rocks and pop. You don't stop till the sweet beat drops. I shall improve as I stick and move. Vivid poems recited.
I think, it's L-O-U-P-E. Cantaloupe would be the most likely, but you hear people say lope a lot, cantaloupe, in Canada especially, where I'm from.
Okay. One of the things we talked about the timeline and how it actually overlaps. We also, in the last episode, talked about the main characteristics of bebop. So it was fast tempos because it wasn't written for people to dance
Although
to.
I've listened to a lot of the playlists of songs from that era, they're not all like, doom, 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 doom. They're not all like that.
I'm really glad you said that because that's one of the things I was thinking. Because actually, a lot of that swing stuff was super fast. Because if you see some of the dancers dancing, like what swing dance is, swinging your arms and the
It's
whole
like
thing,
150, 160
it's really
beats per minute.
fast.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I see that everywhere I look, but I'm not sure I agree with that main characteristic that people say.
Yeah.
The reason they say it is because it was not written for dancers; it was written for listening.
Right.
So
And-
maybe they don't mean the song; they mean what you play within the song.
Yeah, and I mean, a lot of the riffing is very fast. But, all you got to do, listen to an Oscar Peterson album. He's in that era.
Yeah.
And the tempo itself is not necessarily all. It's like playing at 108, 16th notes.
Yeah.
It's the same thing, right? So a lot of the times it's the the speed of the riffs.
So I think that's, again, it's a bit misstated. It's not that the songs necessarily were faster than swing songs. It's that the notes that they played within that tempo, even if they were playing at 108, for example, they were whizzing along so that they were playing, 16th notes when in the swing thing they would have been going a lot slower so that people weren't like, what is that? Oh.
But I'm sure that, for Kind of Blue and some of those albums, what's the is that Coltrane? It's Coltrane, I think. And those are much slower than the bebop era.
yeah.
And I think that you see that a lot more. It's definitely slower tempo than bebop.
But remember, Coltrane, I mean, he was part of the bebop thing, but for me, like, the part that I really was like, wow, he's come into his own kind of as, like, 1960 forward, really.
But Giant Steps, it's pretty crazy fast, a lot of those riffs.
Oh, I mean, that's the main thing with that I think is so cool about that, is to do this really interesting chord progression super fast and then to totally hold it together. We talked about that in the last episode. More prominent role for the percussion.
I got a question for you about that.
Okay.
But as the recording techniques became better, don't you think that it became a little bit easier for them to focus more on bass? Because bass is probably the one thing in those 30s recordings that it's buried.
You can't hear it.
Right?
Yeah.
And the idea that, yes, the bands got smaller, and there was a reason for that. But is it also true that as the recording techniques and the Rudy Van Gelder, guys like that, got better at recording the stuff, and the equipment got better? And
I mean, just at that point, they would have been tight miking.
So then you can hear ba-do-do-do-do-do-do-do, right?
Yeah, totally.
And all of that stuff. So the rhythm section becomes a lot more. So you hear an Oscar Peterson trio, and you can hear everything.
Yeah.
Every note.
Yes.
And that's in the mid 40s. Right.
Totally agree. Yeah, and I don't want to obsess about this, but
also.
yeah.
He doesn't get mentioned a lot, actually.
I mean, he was a huge influence. Ray Charles
was a Nat King Cole knockoff, really, when he
He
started.
was, and they said, get your own sound, and then he did.
And he did, yeah. He certainly did.
He did and a half.
Yeah.
Totally, yes, I totally agree with what you're saying. The interview with Ron Carter that I was just talking about when he was playing through this like processing unit into a head and then a separate cabinet. And he had an amazing sound. Part of that was because it's him playing, but He pointed to that effects unit 2 or 3 times in the interview.
Right.
He was like, it doesn't play the notes for you, but it makes sure that everybody can hear it.
Right.
You know?
Well, we did a gig last night at Galaxy One, which is a kind of a. We didn't. Our 3 of our musicians did.
Okay.
And Rocky was one of them, and he had this. Rocky's our guitar player, and he had one of these units, just a pedal unit,
Mm-hmm.
and he said this one right here, I think it was called Infinity or something like that, or Iridium. It was called Iridium.
Okay.
Just a little pedal. He
Okay.
said that makes all the difference. And it was not a good sound system, and it was not an acoustically nice place to play. It was outdoors, so it was kind of and the guitar just came out like boom. Just,
Plug into whatever.
he can
play.
grab that thing, can go anywhere, and it sounds like it should.
That was the answer. Because he said, I could go and it doesn't matter to me if they have a good amp for me or whatever. I could play right through the board. So, yes, totally. I think what you're saying, a lot of these developments in playing happened because the technology allowed for it to happen.
Right.
So what is a great example?
Yeah.
Like the idea of having the bass line be the main line.
It's probably a first in a lot of ways.
I think so.
Or one of the
At least
first.
on a recording.
Yeah.
Experimentation. So you've actually just, it was one of the characteristics I wanted to talk about, but you just did. Mm-hmm. And then obviously improvising, which became a much more important part of
It was part of swing.
It was
but it was
part
more
of,
of
it was
a-
part of classical music. We've talked about that.
True.
You know?
Yeah. But I mean, it became a thing of like, okay, now I want to hear this guy. Now I want to
Right.
hear that guy. Now I want to hear that guy.
The head. So when you start off a jazz song with the head, right? Then you go into the solo section. The head is just to set up, to get everybody listening, and get the song started. But when you hit that
and
solo,
especially when you're talking about a jam session, right?
yes,
And like we talked about this last time too. It's like everybody. It's the language. It's the framework, right? So you go, okay, this is what we're gonna do.
Yeah.
Here's the head.
Yeah.
Let's start with this one, and we'll go from there. You guys do whatever you want. Play whatever chords you want. In terms of like modalities and stuff like that, you can add your 9ths and your 11ths and your 13ths and do whatever you want. But this
Yeah.
is the structure.
exactly. And then to finish it off, you go back to the head because it tells everybody, okay, we're finished with that soloing part. You've heard us, basically set our instruments on fire, and now we're gonna go back and finish off. Da-da-da-da-da,
Yeah.
You can do lots of comparisons to, let's say, painting, and it sets up the, the canvas.
Mm-hmm.
You made the comparison once before, and I'm going to bring it back, is sonata form. So if you go back to
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
comparing it to classical music, think of it like in sonata form, you have the exposition, you present an idea, a theme, musical melody, whatever.
Now right here.
Okay.
Exposition, a main melody, theme of the song, development.
Mm-hmm.
Number 2 is development, where new musical ideas are introduced, and a recapitulation, which is a recap, restating the same theme, possibly with some variation. Usually in those jazz, in the bebop ones anyway, it's just a repetition of that melody line or that thing from the head.
Yeah. So that's what I was saying when I wrote that. That's from our article.
What is bebop music? You wrote this for where? For Substack?
It's on Substack and it's also on WordPress.
Prolific. Prolific. That's one word.
That's one word. Sounds
All right.
like 3.
Last
Last thing.
Then we're getting off of bebop.
We're off, Bob.
The bop.
You and I talked about at one point. We were talking about. There's a guy who's on social media now. Luxury is the name he goes under, and then there's another guy. This guy Luxury talks about interpolation in terms of.
Wait, can you? Interpolation. I was wondering if that sounded to me like a physics term, but you said you found out that it is, but they're not related.
Correct. So
Okay.
it can be used in mathematics, physics, and it can also be used in music. And he was talking about this idea of taking it's huge in jazz, where they would take the melody from an existing song and they would play it as part of a new song. In jazz, apparently, this is a term, contrafacts. So I read about contrafacts in an article that was actually part of a masterclass by Herbie Hancock. What he's talking about here
In reverse.
in the reverse, when you take the chord structure of a song, he uses the example of a Charlie Parker ornithology. So they took the chord structure of an old structure and then put a new melody on top of it, right?
So they used the chord changes and then used that as the head and then improvised over top of that, or
So yeah, I think it probably would be the chords for the head,
yeah.
and then they went off into their solo section, and then they came back to this. What is our next episode?
You know, I've been wanting to do for a long time a show about composing and creative writing and stuff like that, where you and I talk about how we've done that in the past, but also, you know, maybe we
Looking
can do a
at
little
other-
research on what some of the masters have.
Billy Joel, you've talked a couple times about his process, and
I would love to do an episode on that. And
all right, so yeah, okay, so our next episode may well be that. After we finished recording that day, Leon and I decided that we would actually start a series on songwriting, arranging, motivations for songwriting, and also techniques in the songwriting and arranging. We sent out a survey on social media about influences from music from our youth. We are working on developing that episode as part of this series. We're really enjoying making these, and we hope that you're enjoying listening as well.
Don't forget to like and subscribe. Good night.